Hello everyone and welcome to another video on Angular Shopping Cart UI. In today's video, we are going to go for the login form implementation, and we would be implementing it as a template driven form. Now remember, I would also be going for the register form, and that would be a reactive form. However, in your projects, you must use either one of them. You should not go for both the template driven and the reactive forms. And there might be a question like which one is the better one of them. I would always suggest that you go for reactive forms actually, but I'm covering template driven forms because you would find various template driven forms implemented in various Angular projects. Also, they would help us to understand form handling better and eventually give us a good understanding on the reactive forms. So without further delay, let's get started. Let me open up my project. And also I would start my JSON server for now. We have certain resources, all okay. I would like to open this project in my editor, and also I'd like to go for ng-serve. Now while this starts compiling, let's just check what we have up till now as far as code is concerned. Inside our app module, we have imported an app routing module, and that was done in the previous video where we created a separate module for the routes. And in that particular module, we have the login, register, and shop routes already created. Today, we are going to work on the login route and the login component itself, and later we'd go for the other components as well. So let's check the login component HTML. It is pretty straightforward. There's nothing in it, just that login works message and a router link that would take us to the register form. So we'd like to first try and convert it to an actual login form. Let's also check our output. As you see, it is compiled successfully. Let me open up my browser and localhost 4200. By default, this has to go to shop, and you can see that these are like the shopping items or the products that we have. I can go to the login. From that, I can go to register and back to login and so on. We are going to go for the login form today. So let's code the form first, and we'd be going for some bootstrap classes, of course. So this all would go, and there would be a form to start with. We don't need any action because it's a single page application. Eventually, no action required at all. And we'd have a couple of form groups, or actually more than that. So div form group, we'll have a label, username, and we'd have an input. We don't have to give a type. ID would be username. So here what we're trying to do is just these HTML semantics that we're trying to hold, where the for attribute of label and the ID attribute of the input has to be the same. And that's how we relate the label to the input. And we'd also go with a div, another div form group for password. I can just copy and paste this one. This would have the type password as well. And we'd like to have a button. Let's see how this looks. We are actually missing a couple of classes here, like one class. And same for the password as well. Okay, this is quite a wide form. We might want to make it a bit smaller, like a bit thinner, and also we might want to make it centrally aligned. So I think we can go for a row column combination. The call can be call md 4. And that would become quite small as a form, like it will be 1/3 of the screen. And also I would like to have some offset added. So this looks quite okay. And also the login can be a block level element, the login button itself. So btn block. This looks okay. We might want to keep it in a card as well. So the whole form goes inside the card body. That would just add a border to it, and it'll look good that way. This looks okay and manageable. I think we can add a header that says login. I'll just make it a bit centered. Yeah, looks quite nice. I can go for a CSS that would give me uppercase letters, but I would just go with typing them out. Okay. So, technically this is h2, all right, and h2 would be bigger in size, and we don't want that kind of a size for the login form heading, right? No, so I'm just going to go for a message like login here. So while this message looks okay, now that I think of it, rather than typing it out over here, let's just add some styling. And I might like to call this card a login card. And the login card has a card header, and in that header there is an h2 which we want to style. So we can go for individual styles in here inside the component, but we would like to choose the generic styles.css, and the reason is that we would also like to go for the register form in that same manner, capitalized and all. While that happens, I might not want to go for login card, but I might just call it a guest form card. All right, so now I would add some styling to it. Guest form card, and the h2 inside of it, we'd like to go for text transform uppercase, and font size would be medium. Now I'm not going a definite size here, I'll just rely on abstract things as I did earlier as well. Okay, so this looks fine, and I would just like to keep it that way. You can style it to any extent that you want, but I'll just keep it this way. And also I would like to have labels a bit smaller. Guest form card label, font size, again medium would be okay. Let's see. It's actually already medium, so I just want to get it small. So you see, this looks better, and there would be error messages later. Maybe we might want to make those error messages as well smaller in size. Let's see how that goes. Now this is our login form, and I would also like to add one more field actually. That is the remember me box. So would go for a div form group, and there'll be an input checkbox name. I might not want to give the name at this point. Just give the ID remember. This is the remember me checkbox, and I'd like to have a label remember me or remember. Now this, I think this has to have some margin, class 1, margin left 1. Yeah, so this looks quite okay. So this is our form, and remember me would also help us to clarify one concept, that is the difference between local storage and session storage. So whenever the time comes, we would like to focus on that as well. But about this form, as you know, we are going to go for a template driven form, but we are not trying to implement the login functionality here. Remember, login functionality has a separate video for it and it will be implemented later. Here we are totally focusing on the template driven form. So this would be template driven form, then would be register, that would be a reactive form in the next video, and then after that we would be implementing the login and register functionalities together with our custom server. All right, so let's now dive into the template driven form functionalities, and let's see how we can convert this form into a template driven one. Now let me just list out certain things that we are going to learn as far as form handling in Angular is concerned. Now when we talk about forms, there are certain modules that you would be importing in registering in the imports array inside your app module. So the modules that we would be going for this time around, we'd just go for something called forms module. Later we'd go for a reactive forms module as well. And the directives, there are certain built-in directives. When you register a forms module, you'd get those directives available in your Angular project. The directives that we are talking about are ng form, ng model, ng submit. Now there are also other flags, some properties that we may consider as far as form controls or even forms are concerned in Angular. So let me just say form control slash form properties, and those are touched, untouched, valid, invalid, dirty, pristine. There's something called value, there's something called status, and then there are so many actually, but we are primarily going to use these properties more than the others. So I'm just sticking to these now, but there are so many other properties. I'll show you where to find those properties exactly. So these are the things that we are going to learn as far as forms are concerned in Angular. So let's dive into our login form now. Before we start the actual coding, I'd just like to mention one thing about the template driven forms. Now the name itself suggests that these are template driven forms, essentially because they are driven by the template of a component. You would notice later when we go for reactive forms, they are also called model driven forms actually. So those reactive forms would start from the class. It would be the class of the component that would be driving the whole form. However, as far as template driven forms are concerned, they would be very minimal coding in the component class actually, and most of the coding and the validation and all those things should be done or would be done in this particular template, and that's why they are called template driven forms. So here is the step number 1 to convert this normal form into a template driven one. We'd be creating a template variable, and I would like to call it login form. Now when I create a template variable, this particular variable represents the entire form. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I go for, let's say, a submit event, and this is not an ng submit event, it is just a submit event, and I may want to call login and pass in the template variable that is login form inside that login method. Now we don't have any login method. I would like to create one inside the component. Login, I'm just trying to pass that form as an argument, and I would just log that form inside the console. Now let's see how this behaves. Remember, what we are trying here is I'm going for a submit event, and I'm passing a login form inside my login method, and I'm just trying to log it inside the console. I would like to see what it represents. And you'd also see something that is not expected actually, or for JavaScript developers it is expected. If I hit login, that is if I submit the form, because this button is a submit button, if I click on it, I should see something in the console, right? But if I do that, you can see that this whole form reloads, and that is because the form is submitting to itself. It showed something in the console for a while, but it reloaded. We would like to sort that out. We would not like the form to reload. All right, so let's first do that. In that case, we might just want to prevent the default, that is the submit event of that particular form. So what I would do indeed is, in the login method, I would also pass in the event variable, that is the built-in identifier for the synthetic JavaScript event. If I do this, I would get that $event as the argument here. And what I can do is event.prevent default. The JavaScript developers would definitely be familiar with this prevent default mechanism. And once that is done, let's see what is shown in here. So if I hit login, now you see that you get a form tag. And if I just hover over it, you can see that it highlights the entire form. So this whole variable that we are passing, the template variable, it represents the current login form. Now this part would actually show you how powerful a directive is. And this time around, we are going to use a directive called ngForm. So in this case, if I go for an equal to ngForm, what I'm basically trying to do here is I'm trying to convert this login form into an Angular template driven form. In this case, this would first give me an error because there are certain problems in here. If you see the error message, exactly what it says is that there's no directive, which is basically ngForm. This means that the Angular doesn't recognize ngForm directive. That's actually fine. I mean, that's actually reasonable because we have not registered the form module or the forms module in this particular case. So I would go to my app.module.ts and I would import the forms module. And I would like to register that in the imports array. Now, as soon as I do that, I would get the whole form running. But more importantly, earlier, this variable just gave us the HTML of this whole form when we passed it as an argument to the login function. We would see now what it gives us. You can see that there's no errors and all. And if I hit login, you see now it doesn't give me the HTML. Now it doesn't give me the template, but it gives me an object that is an ngForm object. And that's the power of directives. It actually changed the way the form behaves and it gave us something quite new. However, there'll be something familiar in here like invalid, dirty, status, pristine. There is something called touched and untouched, and then valid and value and all. So you can see that the form has certain flags that we are going to check. It also has an event emitter called ngSubmit. That is the one that we are going to use rather than the usual submit event of JavaScript. Also, there is another flag called submitted, which basically shows whether the form is submitted or not. So let's just now bring everything back to normal. I would take off this event and login form, and I'll just keep it login. And instead of submit, I'll go with ngSubmit. By the way, now since I have the forms module imported, I actually don't have to do event.prevent default inside my login form. So I can just actually completely remove it. I don't need it at all because whenever you register a forms module, Angular knows that it is for a form handling purpose, and hence all the submits are prevented by default. That's a cool feature that Angular has. And I can still pass the form in here. And if I check out the output, you'd see that the submit event is prevented already, and we have an ngForm displayed in here. So this is how you convert a normal form to a template driven form in Angular. And I would like to just get rid of that form here. I would keep the login method though, and I would just maybe take this off, and I just say inside login method. That would be fine for now. Now let's see how we get the values of all these controls from the form to the login method, and then we'll try to display that in the console. For this, I would be using the ng-model directive, and you might also be familiar with ng-model being a directive that helps us in two-way binding in Angular, and that's what we'd be doing. We'd be doing two-way binding. I can straight away go for it this way, like ng-model is equal to a variable name, which would actually be a property in my component class. So I can go for something like username, and then I have a property called username in my component, and then password, and then remember. But what I would like to do instead is I would like to go for something like this, model.username. Here, let me just minimize the Explorer. I would like to go for ng-model. Now what I'm trying to do in here is I'm not willing to create multiple properties for multiple controls inside my component, but I'll just create one property that is model, and that'll be an object which would have this username, password, and remember keys. That's what we try to do. That way we'd just avoid a lot of mess. We'd keep the code clean, and I'd go for a model which will be of any data type. The default value is a blank object, and of course on typing the data we are trying to fill in the model with different keys like username, password, and remember. Also in my login component.ts, instead of this inside login method, I would just like to go for this dot model. So basically whatever is entered inside the input would be displayed as a value for this dot model. So let's try it once. Let's see how this works. You can see that there's one error to start with. If a model is used within a form tag, the name attribute must be set, or the control has to be defined as a standalone control. And there are two examples. We would go with the name because it's the part of the form. Adding a name would make more sense. So we'll go into the HTML, and we'd go for name to be username, a name to be password, and name remember. Also, one thing that I missed is I might want to go for the two-way binding syntax. So we are just not going for the one-way binding. The thing is, like, we want it in a way where whatever I change inside the input should be reflected in the model.username as a value, and whatever the value is changed in the username programmatically should be reflected in the input. So that is basically what two-way binding is, and this is the two-way binding syntax: square brackets and parentheses inside of it. So I would like to go for the same everywhere for ng-model. Basically this is the combination of property binding and event binding. Now I have not gone for data binding in Angular in this series. If you just want an explanation of what data binding is, just let me know. I can make another individual video which would not be the part of this series, but it'll be separate. So let's check the output. Let me type something in, hit login, I get the username and password. If I also check remember me, I would get remember to be true. If I uncheck, remember would be false. So see, one thing that you note here is as soon as I do some interactivity on any of the control, that property is added to the output. So let me give you one other example. If I just write the username, let's say admin, I don't do anything to the password or remember me, it would just give me username as the part of the model, while as soon as I start typing in the password, it would generate that password field as well inside the model, and that would be displayed. And then if I try to do something to remember me, it would give me remember to be true. If I uncheck, it doesn't take away remember, from the model, but it'll just convert it to remember false. So just keep one thing in mind as far as the model that we have created is concerned, or maybe as far as two-way binding is concerned with the ng model attribute. Once you start interacting with the control, at that point only properties are actually created inside this particular model variable. All right, so we are getting the values whatever we enter here, but there are certain problems with validations. Instead of going for the console log, obviously we are going to call an API. So basically I don't want to call an API unless all the form controls are valid. If there is a validation error, in this case I don't want to print anything on the console. Only and only when the whole data is valid would I like to print something on the console. So that is basically what we want to achieve. So let's try and do that. The way I want the validation is that if the username or password is not entered, the form is not valid. Remember me, not necessary to be there. We would consider remember me as false anyways. So in the code, what we would like to go for is having some validations done. Also, I would like to go for ng submit rather than the normal submit event of the form. Now ng submit is just one layer added to the normal submit event that will pose us good benefits in future. So usually when we go for the form, be it a template driven one or a reactive form, we always go for ng submit rather than just the submit one. Now in this case, what we would like to do is add validations, and because these are template driven forms, validations are pretty straightforward. These are HTML5 validations that we add, and eventually it will just render our form valid or invalid based on whatever we have entered. So we know that username and password are required, so I would go for required here, and same for the password as well. This is the HTML5 attribute, remember. The template driven form in Angular picks this up and validates this particular input and the form that way. Also, I would like to know the status of the form, whether it is valid or not. So in that case, I would like to go for passing that form in again. And we would like to check that out inside the login component.ts. Now that we've already done, right? So there's another way we can do it. So what we can do here is I can interpolate inside my card body login form.valid. Now we saw earlier that login form had a valid flag. So in my card body, there is an interpolation done login form.valid. Now by default, you would have guessed that the login form is not valid because now the username and the password, they're required. We have added the required attributes to the username and password. So let's see what we get. We see that here the login form.valid is false. Now this would change real time. If I type in something, admin, and as soon as I start typing in password, you can see that this changes to true. And if I get the password removed, it will change to false. So this login form.valid, actually it's a flag and it's working. So what we can do is the validation can be done in this way. What we want is if the form is valid, then and only then display the contents of the form inside the console. So basically what it means is if the form is valid, then fire the login method, otherwise don't. So there's a very simple fix. We have to not do anything inside the login method. We can simply go for something like login form.valid and double ampersand and the login method. Now this is actually an exploitation of the double ampersand logical operator. What we are trying to do here is that if the login form is valid, then fire the login method. But how would it evaluate itself is that if the first expression evaluates to true, then it would go ahead and execute the next expression, that is the second expression. So if login form.valid is true, then and only then it would execute that login method. So that is basically the logical AND that helps us in here. So now let's check whether this works or not. So I don't enter anything inside username and password. I try to hit login. You can see that nothing displays on the console. If I just enter the username and try to hit login, still nothing. If I enter the password and then I go for login, you can see that I get the username and password displayed in the console. So instead of a console log, of course, we are going to call an API later, but this is basically what I want. However, there is some problem that we are facing in here. If I do not enter anything, and if I try to hit login, what I should expect is a validation message that the username is invalid and the password is invalid and so on and so forth. So in that case, we would like to go for the ng model attribute. Now, the way that the ng model attribute works for an input, one, of course, we have seen that it gives us the facility of two-way binding. However, there is another way that we can use it, and we can actually control the input, and we can also get the flags that is valid and invalid from the input. So let's go for another usage of ng model. Now, this current ng model implementation stays. Next things that we are doing is additional to it. So it would be something like this. The way we did it with the form, login form is equal to ng form, I would go for username, that is my template variable, is equal to ng model. And what this would do is this would create a template variable for us, and this would actually give us an ng model object which would have all the fields available. Let's see what it means. If I do not use ng model, and if I just try to pass the username in here, same as the login form did earlier, it will just give us the username inputs HTML. I can take that inside the login component.ts. Let's say this is just a form control, and instead of this .model for a while, I'll just display control. I might have to enter everything. Let me just enter something in here, and you can see that you get the form control. By the way, the usage of ng model already has added certain classes for us, like ng dirty, ng valid, ng touched, and so on. We'd come back to these classes. These are all dynamically added classes. We only added form control as a class, by the way. So it gives you the input. However, if I go into my login component.html, and if I make the use of ng model directive this way, what it would do is something that it already did with the login form. If I enter some data, hit login, now I no longer get the input as an HTML, but I get it as an ng model object, or an instance of an ng model, which has the properties that represent itself, like name, model, there would be something called value, all right, and then valid, invalid, dirty, pristine, status, touched, untouched, and so on and so forth. So this is the way that we implement the ng model as well in the template driven forms. So I would do that for all of them. It would be password is equal to ng model, and remember is equal to ng model. All right. I would take that username off the login, and I would also do the same in here. Bring it back to this .model. Let me just close everything up. Now, our login form is almost ready, except for that error display. Now what we would do is we try to check out all the flags that this username has. And for now, I'll just display them one by one over here. The same would go for password and remember, but we're just trying it out for username. So we'll just display it for now, like valid is username.valid. This is a flag that would be true and false. I'll first go with valid and invalid, by the way. So invalid, and we'd have a username.invalid. So now what happens here is, by default, we know that the username is required, and hence it would not be valid. And you might have already guessed it, that if we go for username.valid and username.invalid, we'd get true for username.invalid and we'd get false for username.valid. you can see that valid is false and invalid is true. Now that is because input, that is the username, is required, and right now there's no value in it, and hence invalid is true. And this works real time. So basically, if I try to go for some value, you'd see that valid becomes true and invalid becomes false. If I just delete, again making it blank would just make the valid false and invalid true. Let's try with touched and untouched. Let's see what it gives us. Now again, the same drill. I would like you to think about what touched would be and what untouched would be. So let's see what it is. So first of all, as you can see that touched is false by default and untouched is true because simply the control is not touched yet. Valid and invalid, we know why they are false and true respectively. So as soon as I click on the control, you can see that I've clicked on it. However, the touched doesn't turn to true and the untouched also doesn't turn to false. But if I click somewhere else, you can see that the change happens. So the definition of touched is basically when you click on the control and then when the blur happens, basically when you click somewhere else, at that point the control is considered touched. And once the control is touched, it is touched, it doesn't actually change the value at all after that, unless the form is reset, of course. So that happens. And we would also like to check two other flags. That is, one would be dirty and one would be pristine. So dirty and pristine also has its own definition. So first, dirty would be false and pristine would be true. Pristine, by the way, it means pure. So the control would be just pure to start with. And as soon as you start typing in the control, it would be dirty. It would become dirty. So let's say, for example, if I start typing here, you can see that dirty becomes true and pristine now becomes false. Valid is true, by the way, invalid is false. Now, if I, for example, take off the contents from the input, what do you think should happen to valid, invalid, and dirty, pristine properties? Think about it. And some of you might have guessed it correctly, and some of you might be wrong, but let's see what happens. If I just delete everything, you can see valid turns to false, invalid turns back to true. However, dirty still stays true and pristine false. That is, again, the same rule as touched and untouched. Once the control is dirty, it remains dirty unless the form is reset. So these are the 6 flags that you'd be using as far as Angular form handling is concerned. Not specific to template-driven forms, but it is a generic concept in Angular form handling. Now, coming back to the error messages. We would like to use these flags and figure out what error messages do we give. In this case, the error messages that we would be giving is the username is required and the password is required. And also, we would like to go for it in a bootstrap manner. So let's see how that happens. If I go for a span saying username can't be blank, this span, by the way, would be displayed. However, if I go for something like a class invalid feedback, now this class would actually add the error handling mechanism for us. So you see that right now it doesn't give you anything. However, if I go to my form control, that is this, and if I say is invalid, I add this class to my input. Once that is happening, you see that you get the error username cannot be blank. So the is invalid class is the one that has to be basically added and removed if the username is valid or invalid respectively. So in this case, what we would do is we want this class to be dynamic, And for that, I'd be using another directive, that is ng class. This is not related to form handling. People call it class binding. I don't know why people call it class binding, but it's simply a property binding that binds the class as a property. So if I go for ng class, I can pass in variables in here. I can pass in values as well. And if I want to pass the values like literals, it would be it would be in two ways that we can, or three ways we can go for it. Like one would be a string, like is invalid, right? I'm just passing a string literal inside a double quotation, by the way. And that would give me the username can't be blank class again. And then there could be an array as well that I can pass in. That would also be giving me this particular is invalid class added to the form control. However, what I am trying to do in here is I would be going for an object is invalid, and I can either go for true. So if I go for ng class is invalid true, what happens here is that is invalid, the class would be added to the form control. So you can see that it gives you that whole styling. Even if I do an inspect element, you would see that is invalid is added in this particular form control. And if I make it false, you would see that is invalid would be removed. Basically, it is invalid would not be added at all. So it is this true and false that has to be dynamic. And we know that there are flags that we can use now as far as this form control is concerned. So one would think that we can go for username.invalid. So what happens here is invalid, if it is true, then is invalid class would be added to this form control, and we would be seeing the error eventually. And once the username is valid, this invalid flag would be false, and hence is invalid would not be added. So let's check this out. At this point, you can see that is invalid is a class that is added, and hence we are getting this error message. But as soon as I start typing, the username becomes valid, the is invalid class goes, and that's that. However, we don't need this kind of a functionality, because if you check out any form, no form would give you the error messages right away to start with. Only if it is submitted or something, at that point we might get some error messages, right? So we might want to check if the form is submitted or not. So what I would try to do is I would like to go for username or maybe login form dot submit and username dot invalid. So basically what we are trying to tell Angular in here is that if the login form is submitted and if the username is invalid, at that point only show me the error, else just don't show the error. And same for the password also can be done. I would actually go ahead and copy this ng class. Password dot invalid. It's login form dot submitted, not submit but submitted. Is the login form submitted or not? If I hit login, yep, there you go, username can't be blank. I think the span tag of password is missing. Let's just add that. It will be span with a class invalid feedback. Go for password can't be blank. So once we do that, yep, there we go, password can't be blank. And as soon as I start typing here, you see that the errors go, and once that happens, I should be able to hit login and show the data in here. We can also try it in a different manner as well, where I can get rid of this and I can use that login form's valid property. I have also seen people doing this where can go for, instead of login form submitted, we can go for like username dot touched, and here we can go for password touched. So basically, once the user touches a particular control and then the user comes out of it without entering anything, at that point we just show the errors. So that is also something that is possible. And also we can do a property binding of a disabled property. Now HTML has this disabled property, but in Angular we can bind it and we can go for disabled to be true or false. So what we can do here is login form dot invalid. So in that case, if the login form is invalid, if this is true, then disabled would be true and hence the button would be disabled. Else the button would be enabled. So that is also something that is possible. So you can see that now the button is disabled, nothing happens. We can also add some styling here. And that is a generic style, not a login form specific style. Let's see what classes are added in here. Primary disabled. Disabled is just the property. So primary, if it is a primary btn primary disabled, then we might want to also add something into it. So let's just take this, copy this and put it in our styles.css. If the primary button is disabled, cursor, I think the property is not allowed. Okay, not allowed. And what that would do is it will just give us something like Bootstrap 3, which I like quite a lot. So your button is disabled, you're not allowed to click in here, nothing happens in the console. And as soon as you go for a username and password, let's say admin, and if I, for example, touch the password and go somewhere else, it'll tell me password can't be blank, admin, and login. And this happens. So that is the whole idea of having a login form work. So essentially what would now happen is when we implement the login functionality, instead of displaying data in the console, we would call an API on the server that would check our username and password and allow us if our username and password combination is valid. So when that happens, I would like to go to the shop route. So I would like to redirect this form to the shop route, but that's for some other video. In this video, what we saw was the login form converted to a template driven form and certain directives and certain flags as far as the login form is concerned. And we would still work on the register form, and this study that we did of the template driven form would certainly help us in creating a model driven, or we may also call it a reactive register form as well. So this is it for today's video, and hope to see you in the next one. Up till then, bye bye.